In May 1945, a man in a miner uniform, wearing metal glasses and carrying papers under the name Otto Eichmann, was detained by US soldiers near Lüneburg. He had the SS blood group tattoo on his armpit, but no one recognized him. There was no recent photograph, the Reich's files were incomplete, and his name wasn't even listed among the priority targets. Thus, Adolf Eichmann, one of the key figures in the Nazi regime's deportation machinery, spent months as an anonymous prisoner. By the time testimonies in Nuremberg began to point directly at him, it was too late. Eichmann had disappeared from the Cham camp, reinvented his identity, and learned to survive in poverty, silence, and anonymity. Years later, he would resurface under a different name on a street in the outskirts of Buenos Aires, convinced that time and distance were enough to erase his trace. It was the first major televised trial in history, turning his trial into an event followed worldwide. 3 months after the execution, 2 of his sons, Klaus and Horst, were arrested in Buenos Aires with 3 rifles, 17 Molotov cocktails, and plans to attack school buses carrying Jewish children. Even so, they were released without charges and lived for more than 50 years. This documentary rigorously reconstructs everything that happened to Adolf Eichmann, from his escape, hidden life, and capture to his trial and execution. It also delves into the revenge of his children, the money that was never traced, and the files that several governments have preferred to keep sealed for decades. The disappearance and escape of the most wanted fugitive of the 20th century. On May 3, 1945, a reconnaissance squad from the United States Army was operating in a wooded area near Lüneburg, in northern Germany. The soldiers were stopping scattered groups of German soldiers who were moving along secondary roads, trying to escape the Allied advance. At a checkpoint set up at the edge of the forest, the soldiers detained a man of medium height, balding, with metal-framed glasses and a pronounced jawline. He was wearing the worn uniform of a Luftwaffe non-commissioned officer. The documents he carried identified him as Otto Eichmann. The identification number assigned during processing was 63. The man offered no resistance. He answered the routine questions calmly and without contradictions. The soldiers sent him to the Allied internment system, along with tens of thousands of German soldiers captured in the final days of the Reich's collapse. The classification system the Allies had established to identify war criminals worked by reviewing tattoos, cross-checking lists, and taking statements under interrogation. SS members had their blood type tattooed on their left armpit. The prisoner registered as Eichmann had that tattoo. O negative. However, this was not enough to identify him as a war criminal. At that moment, there was no clear and updated photograph the interrogators could use for comparison. The regime's files had extensive gaps due to the deliberate destruction of documents in the final months of the war. The first lists of criminals circulating among Allied intelligence agencies did not include his name. Adolf Eichmann's name was unknown to the military personnel processing prisoners at the Cham internment camp in Bavaria. The Cham camp housed enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, and low-ranking officers. Eichmann spent 8 months in this environment without any interrogation linking him to his true identity. When American interrogators sat him down at a table during the summer of that year, Eichmann claimed to have fought on the Eastern Front as a member of an SS division, to have been wounded, and to have no knowledge of the concentration camps or the extermination system. The interrogators had no evidence to contradict that statement. The man who had organized for years the logistics of transporting millions of Jews to extermination camps was, for the Allied intelligence services interrogating prisoners in Cham, a complete unknown. In November 1945, 24 high-ranking officials from the Nazi regime sat in the defendant's dock at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. The International Military Tribunal had been established through the London Agreement of August that year, with the involvement of the 4 Allied powers. The charges included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Eichmann followed the progress of the trial from his barracks in Cham through the newspapers that arrived at the camp. He accurately identified the statements that could compromise his identity and assessed the risk each testimony posed to his situation. In January 1946, taking advantage of the relaxation of controls and the administrative chaos that still characterized the management of the prisoner camps, Eichmann joined a work group of lumberjacks that left the perimeter. He did not return. The alarm was not triggered in time. When the camp authorities checked the absence of the prisoner registered as Eichmann, the trail was already impossible to follow. The heathland and pine forests stretching between Hamburg and Lüneburg provided the environment Eichmann needed to stay out of the reach of the occupation authorities. He adopted a new alias, Otto Henninger, and found work as a lumberjack in a forestry operation in that area. The job was physically exhausting and poorly paid. The living conditions were of extreme austerity, a cabin with no electricity or telephone, isolated from the nearest settlements. Eichmann made no contact with his family. He did not maintain correspondence. He did not draw attention to himself in the nearby villages where he occasionally appeared to buy supplies. He spoke with restraint, in German without any dialectal marks, eliminating the Austrian accent that could have marked him as a foreigner in that northern region of Germany. When his work as a lumberjack ran out, he found employment on a poultry farm where he worked on hatching chicks. The monotony of the work and physical isolation were the conditions that made his survival possible. Every morning, before starting his day, Eichmann would review the newspapers that arrived in the area. He closely followed the coverage of the Nuremberg trial, the witness testimonies, and the accumulation of documents that the tribunal made public session after session. In 1946, his name appeared in the local press. Dieter Wislichny, a former subordinate of Eichmann who had organized the deportations from Slovakia, testified under oath before the tribunal. Wislichny described Eichmann as the central figure in coordinating the mass transport of Jews to the extermination camps and pointed out that the power he wielded within the SS structure was incompatible with the profile of a minor official. Weeks later, Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz and the direct person responsible for the industrial operation of the camp during its peak years, testified that Eichmann had been in charge of coordinating the arrival of transports to the camp, and that without this coordination, the extermination process would not have been able to reach the scale it did. The appearance of his name in the tribunal's testimonies irreversibly altered Eichmann's situation. The Allied intelligence network, which had overlooked his name in the early post-war months, began to include him in active search lists. The time available to remain in German territory was limited and decreasing. The decision to leave Europe was not based on any ideological calculation, but on an operational assessment. Escape routes to South America existed and had worked for other fugitives. Eichmann initiated the necessary contacts to activate that route. The structure that facilitated the escape of thousands of former Nazi regime members to South America was not a centralized organization with a single leadership. It was a network of individuals, ecclesiastical contacts, corrupt officials, and sympathizers operating at different points across post-war Europe without formal hierarchical coordination. The mechanism depended in large part on the willingness of certain members of the Catholic clergy to provide documentation and cover for the fugitives. The central figure in the operation of this network was Alois Hudal, an Austrian bishop and rector of the Pontifical College Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Hudal had published a text in 1937 defending the compatibility of National Socialism and Catholicism and had maintained an ideological position close to the regime during the war. After the Reich's collapse, Hudal turned the facilities under his control in Rome into a transit point for former members of the Nazi apparatus. He provided letters of recommendation, identity documents, and contacts with the support networks in the port of Genoa that facilitated embarkation to Argentina, Chile, and other South American destinations. Eichmann traveled from northern Germany to the south through Austria, using freight trains, cabins, and rural routes that avoided the checkpoints established on the main roads. He arrived in Italy in the spring of 1950. He was received at a convent in Hudal's network, where he was provided with temporary accommodation while he waited for the necessary documentation to embark. The document he received was a humanitarian passport issued by the International Red Cross, an organization that processed millions of refugee and displaced persons applications in the post-war period. The passport was in the name of Ricardo Klement. The photograph was Eichmann's. The declared nationality was Argentine, and the registered profession was that of a mechanical technician. The International Red Cross had insufficient mechanisms to verify the true identity of those requesting humanitarian documentation amidst the administrative chaos of post-war Europe, and this limitation was systematically exploited by the collaborators of the network. On June 17, 1950, the steamship Giovanna C. set sail from the port of Genoa bound for Buenos Aires. Eichmann travelled in third class with a cardboard suitcase and the passport in the name of Ricardo Klement. During the nearly month-long voyage, he made no contact beyond what was strictly necessary. He did not mention his past. He made no friendships. In mid-July 1950, the Giovanna C. docked at the port of Buenos Aires. Eichmann descended the gangway and set foot on Argentine soil without any immigration control identifying him, nor was any intelligence service waiting for him. He had been in hiding for 5 years in Europe and had arrived in a country whose government, led by Juan Domingo Perón, had actively welcomed thousands of Axis collaborators because they shared a militant anti-communism and because it needed the technical expertise that many of these men could offer. This is how Mossad located Adolf Eichmann. Garibaldi Street in the San Fernando neighborhood, 20 kilometers north of Buenos Aires, had no pavement on several sections. The houses were modest single-story constructions with uneven plaster walls and small, neglected gardens. At number 461, behind a wooden fence, lived the man known as Ricardo Klement since the early 1950s. He arrived walking from the bus stop every night around 7:40, wearing the blue overalls from the Mercedes-Benz factory in Gonzales Catán, where he worked as a technician on the production line. Before entering the house, he would walk around the perimeter of the property, inspecting the state of the garden plants. It was not a decorative habit. He was looking for signs of external presence, fresh footprints, displaced branches, disturbed soil in places where it shouldn't have been. This daily inspection ritual was the visible expression of surveillance that Eichmann had maintained without interruption since January 1946. The house on Garibaldi Street initially had no electricity. Klement moved inside with a pocket flashlight. The furniture was old and functional. The kitchen ran on coal. The only connection to the outside world was a battery-powered radio with which he listened to the news. Eichmann did not receive visitors. He limited trips to the local store to what was strictly necessary. His children, who arrived from Germany months after his settlement in Argentina, grew up in this environment of imposed discipline. They learned not to say their real surname outside the house. They learned to refer to their father by the alias he used. The entire family operated under the rules Eichmann had established to maintain his cover. When Mossad agents located this address years later, the first reaction from several team members was to dismiss the possibility that they had correctly identified the target. The mental image they had of a high-ranking SS official included financial resources, active contacts, and some form of organized protection. Garibaldi Street presented a reality incompatible with that image: an unpaved alley, a house showing signs of wear from time, and a man returning from work on a bus like any worker in the industrial area. Eichmann had understood from the very beginning that visibility was the main vector of risk. Material poverty and social anonymity were the most effective means of protection available. The chain of events that led Mossad to Garibaldi Street did not begin in any intelligence service. It began in Coronel Suarez, an agricultural municipality in the province of Buenos Aires, located 500 kilometers southwest of the capital. There lived Lothar Hermann, a 60-year-old Jewish man, blind, a survivor of the Dachau concentration camp. Hermann had arrived in Argentina in 1938, fleeing persecution. His blindness was a consequence of the years of internment. In 1957, his daughter Sylvia, then 15 years old, began associating with a young German boy her own age named Klaus. The boy was the son of a man who lived in San Fernando and who, as he often told people, had been an important SS officer during the war and had personally met the main leaders of the regime. Klaus used these references as a form of social distinction in the circles of German emigrants in the area. The father's last name was Eichmann. Lothar Hermann overheard this surname in a domestic conversation and recognized it. He had heard it in the reports from the Nuremberg trials, which he followed through the radio. He knew that Adolf Eichmann had been identified in several testimonies as the central figure responsible for coordinating the logistics of the deportations. The surname was not common. The combination of that surname, German origin, the approximate age of Klaus's father, and the details Klaus himself provided about his father's past made the identification plausible enough to act. Hermann asked Sylvia to gather additional information. The daughter, not understanding the implications of what she was doing, continued her contact with Klaus and obtained the address of the family in San Fernando, the father's workplace at Mercedes-Benz, and confirmation that within the family environment, the man was still known as Adolf Eichmann. Hermann had no access to Israeli intelligence services through direct channels. He used the typewriter he had at home and wrote letters addressed to the government of Israel. The first letters received evasive responses or no response at all. The Israeli authorities had no established procedures to process such reports from unverified sources, and the description of a blind survivor in a small town in Argentina claiming to have located the world's most wanted Nazi criminal did not fit within the usual evaluation frameworks. One of these 26 letters reached Fritz Bauer, who had held the position of Attorney General of the state of Hesse in West Germany since 1956. He was Jewish, had been a member of the Social Democratic Party during the Weimar Republic, and had spent the war years exiled first in Denmark and then in Sweden after being detained by the Nazi authorities in 1933. When he returned to Germany after the war, it was with the intention of using the judicial system to pursue those responsible for the regime. What he found in the following years was a judicial apparatus that had not been purged. Judges, prosecutors, police officials and magistrates who had served the Third Reich still held the same positions in 1956 from which they were supposed to be prosecuting their former comrades. Bauer knew the names of several former regime officials who held positions in the Ministry of Justice and in the intelligence services of West Germany. When Bauer received Hermann's information and cross-referenced it with the available files on Adolf Eichmann, he assessed that the lead was solid. The next problem he faced was institutional in nature. If he submitted a formal extradition request through the official channels between West Germany and Argentina, that request would pass through the German Ministry of Justice. Bauer calculated that in this process, the information would be intercepted by one of the former regime officials infiltrated in the system and reach Eichmann before any action could be taken. The only alternative that would maintain the confidentiality of the operation was to bypass the institutional channel completely. Bauer contacted Mossad directly, Israel's foreign intelligence service, without informing his superiors or seeking authorization. The action was a direct violation of international law and of the obligations Bauer had to the state he represented. It was also the only way Eichmann could be brought to justice. Mossad assigned the operation the codename Dbuk. The first step was to confirm the identity of the target before planning any action. For this phase, they sent Zvi Aharoni, an intelligence officer specialized in analysis and information gathering. Aharoni traveled to Buenos Aires with a hidden camera inside a leather briefcase. For several weeks, he followed the man who made the daily journey between Garibaldi Street and the bus stop. He observed him buying the newspaper. He followed him walking through the streets of San Fernando. During one of these surveillance operations, Aharoni boarded the same bus as Eichmann and sat in the seat immediately behind him. He opened the briefcase, aimed the camera at the back of Eichmann's head, and took several shots. The photographs showed the nape and the side profile. Eichmann's ears had a distinctive morphology, disproportionately large with fleshy lobes, specific enough to be compared with archive photographs taken during the years of the regime. The comparison confirmed the identity. The target of Operation Dbuk was Adolf Eichmann. The planning of the capture took several months. Mossad set up an operational house in Buenos Aires, which they called Tira, where the agents rehearsed every phase of the procedure. The person in charge of executing the physical arrest was Peter Malkin, a Polish-born agent whose family had been killed during the German occupation of Poland. Malkin prepared the operation with such precision that even the lining of his leather gloves was carefully considered. He didn't want his skin to come into direct contact with Eichmann's. The only Spanish phrase he needed for the interception phase was "un momentito, señor," which he practiced for weeks until he mastered the pronunciation. The agents had established that Eichmann got off the bus every night around 7:40 and walked the final stretch to Garibaldi Street on foot. On the night of May 11, 1960, a vehicle occupied by Mossad agents was parked on a side street near the bus stop. When Eichmann got off and began walking, the vehicle slowly moved alongside him. Malkin jumped out, grabbed Eichmann by the arms and pushed him into the car. The operation lasted no more than 10 seconds. Eichmann offered no physical resistance. The surprise and immediate shock of what happened paralyzed him. The vehicle drove away from the area without raising any alarms. In Eichmann's pockets, the agents found a comb, a small pocket knife, and a plastic cigarette case. For the next 9 days, Eichmann remained in the Tira house, blindfolded and chained in a room. The agents communicated with him in Spanish to prevent him from identifying their origin by the language. He was subjected to continuous interrogations. The interrogators wanted a verified confession in which Eichmann himself would acknowledge his identity. For hours and days, Eichmann denied, altered facts, and evaded direct questions. When he finally relented, he did so in a soft voice, with the Austrian accent he had eliminated from his everyday speech for 15 years. He confirmed his real name, Adolf Eichmann. The confession was recorded. The agents now had what they needed for the next phase. The logistical problem was getting Eichmann out of Argentina without the Argentine authorities detecting the operation. Israel was celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Argentine May Revolution during those days, which justified the presence of an official Israeli delegation in Buenos Aires. The El Al plan that was carrying the delegation back to Israel would be the extraction method. On the night of May 20th, the agents dressed Eichmann in an airline crew uniform, sedated him with a dose calculated to keep him unconscious for the necessary time, and placed him in the vehicle heading to the airport. At the immigration controls, they presented documents accrediting him as a sick crew member requiring urgent repatriation. The controls raised no objections. The plane took off with Eichmann aboard. It made a technical stop in Dakar for refueling and landed in Israel. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion informed the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that Adolf Eichmann was detained on Israeli soil and would be subjected to a judicial process in accordance with Israeli law. The news spread across international news outlets within hours. The Argentine government formally protested and took the case to the United Nations Security Council, which passed a resolution condemning the violation of Argentine sovereignty. West Germany requested explanations through diplomatic channels. Israel acknowledged the operation, formally accepted the irregular nature of the capture procedure, and maintained the position that the judicial process would take place in Jerusalem. Why did Eichmann's trial change history? The Beit Ha'am Auditorium in Jerusalem was built in 1956 for cultural functions and public events. In the spring of 1961, Israeli authorities converted it into a courtroom for the trial of Adolf Eichmann. The adaptation included the installation of a bulletproof acrylic structure in the center of the room. The booth measured approximately 1.8 meters in height, 1.5 meters in width, and 1 meter in depth. It had an independent ventilation system, an integrated desk, and space for the defendant to sit during the sessions. The bulletproof glass, several centimeters thick, was transparent from all angles. The declared purpose was to protect the defendant from potential attacks. The functional purpose was to keep him visible to journalists, survivors, and television cameras, while preventing any physical contact between him and the courtroom. The trial began on April 11, 1961. It was the first time an Israeli court had tried a foreign citizen for crimes committed outside the borders of the State of Israel. It was also the first time in history that a trial of this nature was broadcast live on television to audiences around the world. Correspondents from 50 countries had been accredited. The seats allocated for the public were filled from the first day by Holocaust survivors who had traveled from various countries to attend the sessions. Robert Servatius, a German lawyer who had represented several defendants in the Nuremberg trials, took on Eichmann's defense. Before the presentation of evidence began, Servatius raised a jurisdictional objection. Eichmann had been captured in Argentina through an operation that was not authorized by any treaty or international law. The state prosecuting him was the same one that had ordered his abduction. The court rejected the objection within 24 hours. The ruling stated that the nature of the crimes charged was of such gravity that it placed the Israeli court's jurisdiction above any irregularities in the capture procedure. The trial continued. Gideon Hausner was the Attorney General of the State of Israel. He had been chosen to lead the prosecution because his Polish family had been exterminated during the German occupation. Hausner built his prosecution strategy on a premise that differed from the usual criteria in ordinary criminal proceedings. Instead of focusing solely on presenting evidence about the specific acts of the accused and the chain of responsibilities directly attributable to him, Hausner designed a trial in which the complete extermination of the European Jewish people would be documented through the direct testimony of survivors. He called witnesses who had never had personal contact with Eichmann, men and women who had gone through the ghettos, the trains, the selections at the railway platforms of the camps and the gas chambers, and who could describe each phase of that process from direct experience. The three judges, headed by Moshe Landau, the presiding judge, accepted this strategy. The declared goal of the trial was not only to establish the individual guilt of the accused. Eichmann listened to the testimonies from the glass booth with headphones on. The simultaneous translation into German had a slight technical delay. During the sessions, he kept his gaze on the documents on his desk and rarely looked at the witnesses testifying on the stand. He had a detailed memory of the administrative and organizational aspects of his role during the regime period. He could accurately describe the hierarchical structure of the various departments he had worked in, the names of his superiors at each stage, and the communication protocols between different offices. When witnesses cited figures of deported people or described specific events involving his direct participation, Eichmann would systematically claim that he didn't remember, that the specific data was beyond his knowledge, and that his role had been to transmit orders without the ability to make independent decisions. The prosecution had an element that invalidated this defense: the Sassen tapes. Willem Sassen was a Dutch journalist who had served in the Waffen-SS during the war and was living in Argentina as part of the German émigré community in Buenos Aires. In 1956, Sassen proposed to Eichmann a collaboration. He would pay Eichmann to participate in a series of recorded conversations that would serve as the basis for a text that Sassen wanted to publish as a historical vindication of the German version of the war. For months, Eichmann and Sassen met at the journalist's home. The sessions were recorded without Eichmann knowing the exact details. In these conversations, recorded in the context of an Argentina where Eichmann felt protected by the distance and time passed since the collapse of the Reich, he described his role and his convictions in a radically different way than he would present them in court. Sassen transcribed the content of the recordings and made notes. Part of this material reached the Israeli prosecution before the trial began. In the transcripts, Eichmann described his work not as that of a civil servant forced to execute decisions made by others, but as that of a man who believed in the purpose of what he was doing. He described the final solution not as an order he was carrying out, due to hierarchical imperatives, but as a goal he shared. In one of the most quoted fragments during the trial, he claimed that if the number of Jews exterminated had reached 10 million, that result would have given him satisfaction. The prosecution introduced the transcripts as documentary evidence. Servatius objected, arguing that the content of these conversations was the boasting of a man trying to impress his interlocutor and did not reflect the actual thoughts of the accused. The judges read the excerpts and evaluated them along with the rest of the documentation. While the public sessions were taking place in the main courtroom in the Israeli police headquarters in Jerusalem, Captain Avner Less, a specialized interrogation officer born in Berlin, conducted private interrogations with Eichmann that lasted for 275 hours over several months. Less questioned him in German and used a non-confrontational method. The full transcription of these interrogations exceeds 3,500 pages. In this context, Eichmann spoke with a level of detail he did not reproduce in court. He described to Less a visit to Minsk in 1941, where he witnessed mass shootings. He described the pit, bodies piled up to such an extent that the pressure from the gas produced by decomposition made the surface of the pile move. He stated that his knees trembled. He returned to Berlin in the official vehicle. As he went to see Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo and his direct superior, he raised the issue that the method of shooting in pits was not functional as a mechanism for systematic extermination. Müller told him to continue organizing the transports. Eichmann returned to his office and carried on. The trains continued to depart the next day, and the week after, and for the next 3 years. During the court sessions, several witnesses caused interruptions that reporters covering the trial recorded in their reports. Yehiel Denur, a survivor of Auschwitz who had published literary testimonies about his experience in the camps under the pseudonym Katzetnik, took the stand and began to testify. During his testimony, he turned his head towards the glass booth. Those present observed that his body began to shake with increasing intensity. Dinur did not finish the sentence he was speaking. He collapsed to the floor, fainting before the guards could reach him. He was removed on a stretcher. Michael Goldman Gilad, a middle-aged man who worked security at the courthouse and had been assigned as a guard during the sessions, was called to testify. He took the stand, swore to tell the truth, and pointed at the accused. He identified Eichmann as the officer who, when he was a teenager at one of the camps, had given him 80 lashes. The court withdrew to deliberate. Eichmann returned to his cell with the stack of documents under his arm, and the Sassen tapes forever recorded in the file. What the judges were going to read that night left no room for doubt. The man who claimed to have obeyed orders had personally argued with Himmler to ensure that the extermination did not stop. What happened to Eichmann in his final moments before he died? On December 13, 1961, the presiding judge, Moshe Landau, began reading the verdict. The courtroom was filled to its capacity. The reading lasted for several hours. Eichmann did not appear visibly disturbed during the reading. He kept his eyes fixed on the documents on his desk, occasionally nodding or shaking his head when the translation reached his ears. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations, the SS, the Reich Security Service, and the Gestapo. The court explicitly rejected the defense of just following orders. It stated that Eichmann had acted not only as an executor, but as an active participant in the design and implementation of the system. 2 days after the verdict, the court handed down the sentence, the death penalty. The execution would be carried out by hanging. Several European governments raised the issue that the trial should have been conducted before a supranational court, arguing that a state directly affected by the crimes could not simultaneously serve as the judge. Israel rejected this position without modifying any terms of the trial. Eichmann was transferred to the Ramla prison, located 20 kilometers southeast of Tel Aviv. The cell had white walls, an iron bed, a table, a chair, and a high ventilation window through which natural light entered. A guard stood watch at the door 24 hours a day. Eichmann established a routine of systematic reading using materials provided by the prison library. He requested philosophy, literature, and biographical texts. Defense attorney Savasius filed an appeal to the Supreme Court of Israel. The document reiterated the arguments already used in the first instance. On May 29, 1962, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. At the end of April that year, David Ben-Gurion authorized a visit from Vera Eichmann, the wife of the convicted man, to the Ramla prison. The operation was kept out of the public eye. Vera Liebel had met Adolf Eichmann in 1935. They married the following year and had 4 children. During the war, she lived in Berlin, separated from her husband's operations. When the regime collapsed, she waited for years without confirmation of whether Eichmann was alive. When he appeared in Argentina, she followed him with the children, asking no questions about the past. She arrived in Israel on a commercial flight, was received by security agents, and was taken directly to the prison. Husband and wife sat on opposite sides of a thick glass for 90 minutes. Eichmann asked about their children. He conveyed instructions for them to stay strong. He did not address the crimes he was accused of. He did not apologize. Vera cried for most of the time. When the visit ended, Eichmann returned to his cell and resumed reading the book he had left open on the desk. Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher born in Vienna and a professor in Frankfurt before his exile, who had emigrated to Palestine in 1938, was 84 years old when the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. Buber wrote a letter to the President of the State of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, requesting that the death sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. The argument was not based on Eichmann's innocence or a reduction of his responsibility. Buber argued that executing Eichmann would create the false public impression that justice had been done, and that this impression would be misleading. The crimes of the Holocaust were on a scale that no individual punishment could truly match. Hugo Bergman, a philosopher and rector of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, supported the request. Other intellectuals joined in, but Ben-Zvi reviewed the petition with his advisors and rejected it. Eichmann personally wrote the clemency petition addressed to the president. On the night of May 31st, a prison official approached Eichmann's cell with the formal notification. Adolf listened to the reading of the document. His eyelids moved in a quick, involuntary blink. It was the only visible sign of reaction throughout the night. He requested, as his last wish, a ballpoint pen, paper, cigarettes, and a bottle of white wine. The officials fulfilled the request. Eichmann sat on the bed and wrote letters, one for Vera, another for his children. The letters contained no reference to the crimes he was accused of. There was no acknowledgement of responsibility. They were domestic communications conveying well wishes to the recipients. Once the letters were finished, Eichmann requested the presence of Protestant pastor William Hull, who had visited him several times during his internment and with whom he had had conversations about religious topics. Hull was summoned. Upon arrival, the officials informed him that permission to access the cell had been denied. Eichmann spent the following hours alone. While the guards carried out the mandatory observations from the door in silence, Eichmann drank the wine, smoked the cigarettes, and waited. He did not call for any guard. He did not ask for anything else. When the bottle was empty and the ashtray full, he turned off the light and lay down on the bed without sleeping. The gallows and the revenge of Adolf Eichmann's children. Shalom Nagar was 26 years old when he was assigned to the wing of the Ramla prison, where Adolf Eichmann was awaiting the outcome of his trial. Nagar was of Yemeni descent, had grown up in a low-income neighborhood in Tel Aviv, and had been working as a guard in the Israeli prison system for several years. To staff the wing where Eichmann was housed, the prison administration had subjected candidates to a specific psychological evaluation. The central criterion was the ability to maintain stable professional behavior while in direct contact with the accused. Nagar passed the evaluation because he presented the required profile. No uncontrolled hostility, nor attitudes that could be interpreted as leniency. The exclusion procedure applied to guards with family backgrounds in the Holocaust was systematic. Officials who had concentration camp identification numbers tattooed on their arms were reassigned to other sections before Eichmann's internment period in Ramla began. The prison administration assessed that the presence of these guards in direct contact with the accused posed a risk of incidents that the context of the trial could not afford. From the beginning of his assignment, Nagar established a standard of conduct that was not imposed on him by any regulations. He would not touch Eichmann. He would not shake his hand. He would make no gesture that could be interpreted as a recognition of shared humanity. Each day, he delivered the food to the cell, checked that the food had not been tampered with before serving it, and left without saying unnecessary words. Nagar's job was to ensure that Eichmann remained alive until the execution of the sentence. On the night of May 31st, 1962, Nagar was on leave. He had spent the day with his wife and young son in Tel Aviv, when a police van pulled up next to them on the street and two officers asked him to accompany them. Nagar received no explanation at the time. He got into the vehicle. His wife stayed on the sidewalk with the child. During the drive to Ramla, the officers explained the situation to him. Eichmann's execution was scheduled for that night. Someone had to pull the lever that opened the trap door of the gallows. Several guards who had been asked to do it had refused. Nagar was next on the list, but he said no. He didn't want to perform that function. He had never killed anyone, and he was not going to start doing so under these conditions. The agents led him into an office. On the table lay a manila envelope. Nagar opened it. Inside were photographs taken in the concentration camps during the liberation of 1945. Children. Naked children, their skin clinging to their skeletons, piled in pits or lying on the floors of the barracks. Children who had died in the camps, logistically coordinated by the man who would be executed that night if someone pulled the lever. When Nagar closed the envelope, he nodded. The scaffold had been built in a prison room that until a few days prior had served as a warehouse. Israel had never executed a convict until that moment and possessed no infrastructure or established protocol to carry out an execution. The officials in charge had consulted procedural manuals from other prison systems, primarily of British origin, and had commissioned the construction of a solid but improvised structure. A wooden platform 1 meter high, a top crossbeam from which a new hemp rope hung, and a central trapdoor operated by a metal lever. The length of the rope had been calculated so that the speed of the fall would cause the fracture of the cervical vertebrae without the resulting tension reaching the threshold of decapitation. The mechanism had been tested several times before the night of the execution. At 1:20 a.m. on June 1st, the guards opened the cell door. Eichmann was awake. He wore dark trousers, a white shirt and a suit jacket. He was not handcuffed. The guards signaled for him to follow them. Eichmann walked down the corridor without resistance. In the minutes prior to leaving the cell, the prison administration had reversed its denial and authorized the entry of Pastor William Hull, who was now walking by his side. Hull offered him communion, but Eichmann refused it and said simply that he was not prepared to receive it. In the corridor that connected the cell wing to the execution room, Rafi Eitan stood waiting, leaning against the wall. Eitan had directed the capture operation in Argentina in May 1960. He had coordinated the 9 days of detention at the Tira house, supervised the extraction and the transfer by plane. That night, he represented the Mossad as an observer during the final procedure. Eichmann recognized Eitan when he saw him in the corridor. He stopped for a moment, looked at him, and said he hoped Eitan was not one of those who had to do the work that night. He climbed the steps to the platform without the need for physical guidance and positioned himself over the trapdoor. An officer asked if he wanted the hood. Eichmann declined. Pastor Hull began to read a prayer softly. Eichmann did not move his lips or close his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the white wall in front of him. When Hull finished, there were several seconds of silence. Eichmann spoke his last words. He said he hoped Germany had a better future, that his example would serve to teach later generations that loyalty to duty and obedience were values that should be honored. The officer acting as the execution judge raised his hand and the trapdoor opened. The doctors present checked the pulse and heart activity. The recorded time was 11:45 p.m. local time, although the calendar had already turned to June 1st. Adolf Eichmann was dead. An hour later, Nagar returned to the room. His task was not over. He had to lower the body. In the following months, he suffered from episodes of insomnia and loss of appetite, which his family noticed but that Nagar could not explain. The Israeli government had decided to keep his identity as the executioner in absolute secrecy to protect him from retaliation by neo-Nazi groups. Nagar lived with that burden, unable to share it for decades. It wasn't until the early 21st century that he agreed to make public statements about what had happened. In those interviews, he described the decision as follows. He did not want to kill anyone. But after seeing the photographs of the children, he understood that it was his duty. Pinchas Zeklikovsky was a Holocaust survivor who had lost his entire family in the extermination camps. In the weeks leading up to the execution, the Israeli government tasked him with constructing an industrial furnace at a factory in Petach Tikva. The technical requirements were precise. The facility had to reach an operating temperature of 1,800 degrees Celsius, enough to reduce a human body to ashes in the shortest time possible. Zeklikovsky explained to the factory workers that the furnace had been ordered by a client who needed high-temperature incineration of fish bones for fertilizer production. The workers built the installation in a windowless shed, with no identifying signs and no visible access from the outside. The execution of Adolf Eichmann in 1962 was not the final chapter of his story, but the prologue to a private war. Far from the courtroom in Jerusalem, his children inherited a surname turned into a stigma and a fury that would soon explode. In the shadows of the Argentine capital, the Eichmann family moved from hiding to activism, determined to avenge what they called the lynching of the century. In Buenos Aires, Vera Eichmann and her 4 children followed the trial through the radio and press during the 4 months it lasted. For the world, it was justice. For them, it was a farce, a lynching, a political theater constructed by the victors to humiliate the defeated. Vera had established that narrative from the very first day Adolf Eichmann's name appeared in the Argentine newspapers with the news of his capture. Her husband had been kidnapped. He had been illegally transported to a foreign country. Klaus was 25 years old when the court sentenced his father to death. The day after the conviction, he didn't lock himself in his house to mourn. He organized a press conference. In front of local and international journalists gathered in Buenos Aires, Klaus Eichmann stood before the microphones and declared in a firm and unwavering voice, "Everything they accuse my father of is pure propaganda. These war crimes are not true. I have heard that the Jewish leaders themselves ordered these executions because they believe the Jews must be martyrs." The cameras recorded a young man, tall, with a square jaw and an unspoiled German accent, speaking those words with the calm of someone who believes every word they utter. It wasn't the impromptu reaction of a son disoriented by grief. It was the speech of someone who had spent years constructing this version of history in meetings at the German clubs of Buenos Aires, in late-night conversations with his father's comrades, and during after-dinner talks in a house where the Third Reich hadn't fallen but was in exile, waiting for its moment. Vera had done her job well. When the confirmation of the execution arrived on June 1st, 1962, something in Klaus and Horst broke and, at the same time, hardened. The rage didn't paralyze them. It activated them. In the following weeks, they began to meet with their father's old comrades at the German clubs in the city. The Nazi community in Buenos Aires was outraged. The men who had drunk with Adolf Eichmann, who had toasted to the Führer in his house on Garibaldi Street, who had built a miniature replica of the world they had lost in 1945 in those Buenos Aires neighborhoods, spoke of revenge. They spoke of restoring their honor. They spoke of responding. Klaus and Horst didn't just want to talk. The first acts were small and deliberately anonymous. In the weeks following the execution, a series of incidents began to be recorded in various neighborhoods of Buenos Aires with a Jewish population. Business windows were broken during the night. Swastikas were painted on synagogue facades before dawn. Threatening letters were left in mailboxes of families identified by surname or address. The Argentine police recorded each of these incidents in separate reports and did not connect them to each other. Buenos Aires in 1962 was a city with complex political tensions and frequent episodes of street violence. The incidents were filed away without active investigation. This was exactly what Klaus and Horst needed, time to plan what would come next. They recruited half a dozen young men from the German community of Buenos Aires. They were not war veterans. They were the second generation, sons of Nazis, raised in the same ideological bubble as the Eichmann brothers, men who had grown up hearing that the Third Reich had been betrayed and that the Jews were responsible for that betrayal. To recruit these men, Klaus and Horst didn't need complex arguments. They only needed to name their father and explain what they wanted to do. The logic was simple in its horror. They killed our father. We will kill their children. They identified 3 Jewish schools in different neighborhoods of the city. They studied the routes of the school buses that transported children between the residential neighborhoods and these educational centers for weeks. They paid special attention to Route 47, which every morning picked up between 30 and 40 Jewish primary school children and transported them to one of the identified schools. They documented the peak times when children arrived at the school buildings. They recorded the moments when mothers gathered on the sidewalk waiting for their children to be released. They studied the layout of the courtyards and calculated the approach angles from the street. Carmen Brettin Lindemann, who later became Horst's partner, described to the Daily Mail the way Horst approached any problem. He was very cerebral, planning everything with obsessive detail, like his father. In the Buenos Aires maps that investigators found in the apartment after the arrest, the 3 schools were marked with red circles. The bus routes were drawn with blue lines. The schedules were meticulously noted in the margins with tight and regular handwriting. Route 47 was marked as the primary target, with an additional note about the volume of passengers during the time slot from 7:30 to 8 a.m. They obtained the weaponry from the black market in Buenos Aires, which in the 1960s was an active and accessible market for those who knew whom to ask within the right circles. They studied manuals on how to make homemade explosives. They tested detonators in sparsely populated areas on the outskirts of the city. They would meet at night in safe houses within the community. Someone was financing the operation. Klaus and Horst were not wealthy men. Klaus worked as an electronics technician, and Horst had various poorly paid jobs. The materials they accumulated cost more than their salaries could explain. Documents from the United States Department of the Treasury from 1945 estimated that the German assets deposited in Argentina through Nazi networks amounted to the equivalent of $10 billion today. Part of this capital circulated within the German community of Buenos Aires through informal systems of loans and transfers among comrades. Who exactly was financing Klaus and Horst's cell is a question the classified police report does not answer, and the Argentine files, sealed until 2025, may clarify. The operational plan was as follows: plant explosive devices on the bus for Route 47 during the night, set to detonate during the morning route when the vehicle was full of children. Simultaneously, attack the 3 schools with Molotov cocktails during the peak times when students would be in the courtyards or entrances. The simultaneity was deliberate, to distribute the emergency points to prevent rescue services from concentrating on a single location. Not all expatriate Germans in Buenos Aires shared the Nazi ideology. Some had fled Hitler's own regime, others simply wanted to forget and build a life without the past catching up with them. When Klaus and Horst expanded their recruitment circle, one of the men they approached was horrified by what was being proposed to him. He contacted the authorities. His name was never made public. He was protected as a confidential source. But his call led the police directly to Klaus's apartment in Buenos Aires. According to later journalistic reports, the informant was not just any citizen who had decided to act on his own initiative. He was a contact of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, which had maintained informants within the German community of Buenos Aires since 1960, as part of the ongoing surveillance that followed the extraction of Adolf Eichmann, had detected the organization of the cell and had chosen to alert the Argentine police rather than act directly. After the diplomatic scandal caused by Eichmann's kidnapping, Israel could not afford another operation on Argentine soil that could be documented and attributed. When the agents raided Klaus's apartment, the brothers and their collaborators resisted. There was a brief gunfight before they were outnumbered and disarmed. Inside, the police found and catalogued the contents of the operation in a report that remained classified for decades. 3.22 caliber rifles, 17 Molotov cocktails in various stages of preparation, some with the fuse already in place and the corkstopper sealed, enough explosive material to construct at least 5 medium-sized bombs, Nazi propaganda, flags with swastikas, portraits of Hitler, copies of Mein Kampf, and the blueprints, maps with the schools marked, routes traced in blue, schedules noted, Route 47 highlighted as the primary target with the data on the volume of children it transported each morning. Klaus and Horst were taken to the police station. During the interrogation, neither of them expressed remorse. They initially denied that the materials were intended to target Jewish sites. When the evidence made that denial unsustainable, they stopped talking. The Argentine government faced a major political dilemma. Argentina had protested to the United Nations Security Council over the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann 2 years earlier. It had accused Israel of violating its territorial sovereignty. It had demanded international accountability. Now, the sons of that same man had been arrested on Argentine soil with a full arsenal and documented plans for a terrorist attack against buses carrying Jewish children. Publicly prosecuting Klaus and Horst meant admitting that Argentina had harbored not only Nazi fugitives, but also an active infrastructure of organized violent extremism for years. It meant acknowledging that the impunity with which these men had lived for a decade was not an accident of administrative negligence, but the result of a deliberate policy of protection. The government made the only decision that allowed it to avoid this exposure. Klaus and Horst were detained for 48 hours, interrogated and released with a warning. There were no formal charges, no trial. The police report was classified. Argentine media did not cover the episode. The most serious discovery of Nazi terrorist activity on South American soil since the end of the war was buried in a file that took decades to be partially accessible. 2 years later, in 1964, Horst was briefly arrested for a second time, this time for possession of firearms and Nazi propaganda materials. The sentence was minimal. Carmen Lindemann recalled that Horst emerged from that period of detention even more convinced that the system was acting unjustly against him. Klaus did not face any additional consequences. Both continued their lives in Buenos Aires. Both kept active contact with the Nazi expatriate network in the following decades. Carmen recounted that in the 1970s, Horst mentioned to her that he had participated in a meeting where Nazi veterans discussed future actions without specifying the type of actions. There is no public evidence of additional terrorist plans after 1962, nor is there any evidence that their convictions changed at any point. While Klaus and Horst were organizing their cell in 1962, someone else in Buenos Aires was following Klaus with a different, more personal intention. His name was Jakob Rosenberg. He was 52 years old. The number A7294 was tattooed on his left forearm. He had lost his wife, his 2 children, his parents, and 3 brothers in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Eichmann had personally coordinated the deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944, the last great mass transport of the war, which filled the platforms of Auschwitz that summer when the Reich was already crumbling. Rosenberg was one of the survivors of that transport. He had arrived in Argentina in 1947, seeking to start over. He worked as a tailor in the once neighborhood. He rarely spoke of the past, but when, in 1962, he saw the news of Adolf Eichmann's execution, something in him shifted. He told a friend, "It wasn't enough. A man dies once. 6 million died because of him." He began discreetly investigating within the Jewish community of Buenos Aires. He asked careful questions, and he discovered that Eichmann's children were still living in the city, that Klaus worked not far from his shop. For weeks, Rosenberg followed Klaus. He studied his routines. He learned where he lived, where he ate, where he drank. In the interview recorded by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Rosenberg admitted what he had thought during those weeks of surveillance. "I thought about killing him. That's all I thought about. I could have followed him one night. I could have done it." In June of 1964, Rosenberg located Klaus in a cafe in the Flores neighborhood. Klaus was alone, drinking a cortado, reading a German newspaper. Rosenberg sat at the table next to him, waited a few minutes, then spoke to him in German. "You are Klaus Eichmann." It wasn't a question. Klaus looked up and replied that he didn't know what he was talking about. Rosenberg rolled up his left shirt sleeve and showed the tattoo. "Your father organized this," he said. "He organized my deportation, my family's deportation." Klaus looked at the number on the forearm. His face hardened. "My father was a bureaucrat. He followed orders. He didn't decide anything." Rosenberg responded that he had read the trial documents, that he had seen the signatures, that his father decided the train schedules, the routes, the quotas, every detail. Klaus slowly closed the newspaper. "And what do you want from me? An apology? I have nothing to apologize for." Rosenberg told him that he wanted Klaus to know that by defending his father, he was becoming an accomplice to those deaths. Klaus stood up. "You know nothing. History judged them wrongly. It was a time of war. Everyone did what they had to do." Rosenberg also stood up. "Everyone? Did the children who were gassed do what they had to do? Was my 3-year-old son an enemy soldier?" Something crossed Klaus's face at that moment. Witnesses to the episode could not pinpoint whether it was doubt or simply discomfort. It lasted only a second. Klaus left some coins on the table and walked toward the door. Rosenberg called to him one last time. "Do you know what it's like to carry the guilt of 6 million? Because you carry it. Every day that you defend your father, you carry it." Klaus stopped at the door, his back to Rosenberg. He didn't turn around. He simply said, "I don't carry anything. I sleep perfectly well." And he left. Rosenberg remained standing in the empty cafe for several minutes. Then he sat down again. He ordered another coffee, and he cried in silence. In the 1989 interview, the interviewer asked him why he hadn't done something more. Rosenberg replied, "Because that would have made me what they were, and I had already lost everything. I wasn't going to lose my humanity as well." He was asked if he regretted not having done it. He answered, "Every day. And I also thank myself every day for not having done it. Both things are true at the same time." Jakob Rosenberg died in 2003 at the age of 91. Klaus Eichmann lived until 2015. Dieter, the third child, born in Prague in 1942, chose a radically different strategy. He disappeared. He didn't condemn his father, but neither did he openly defend him. He married an Italian woman named Martha Valinotti. He worked as a construction manager, dividing his time between Germany and Argentina for decades. When he retired, he did so living off rental properties he had accumulated over the years. The origin of this wealth was never publicly explained. According to available records, Dieter did not accumulate his wealth through conventional jobs. In 1960s and 1970s, Argentina, it was easy to move money without leaving a trace through informal loan and transfer systems operating within the expatriate German community. In 2018, investigators from Daily Mail managed to locate him still living in Buenos Aires, in an anonymous neighborhood, in an apartment with reinforced security measures that seemed striking for a man of his age and apparent profile. When a reporter managed to find him on the street, Dieter turned around and walked away without saying a word. According to Carmen, Horst's ex-partner, Dieter believed his father was innocent. But he never said so. He never defended him. He never attacked him. The fourth child was different from all the others. Ricardo Eichmann was born in Buenos Aires on November 5, 1955. When his father was captured, he was 5 years old. Too young to have attended the clandestine meetings at the German clubs, too young to have heard the toasts to the Führer, and for Vera to finish her indoctrination process before history interrupted it. In his adolescence, Ricardo made a decision that none of his brothers made. He moved to Germany. Far from the Nazi community of Buenos Aires, far from Vera, far from Klaus and Horst. He studied archaeology at the University of Tübingen. He specialized in prehistory and ancient cultures. He built a solid academic career based on scientific publications. And in 1995, in an interview with Der Spiegel, he declared, "I agree with the verdict and sentence my father received. What he did was atrocious. There is no justification." These were simple words. In the context of the Eichmann family, they were revolutionary. Klaus and Horst immediately and definitively cut off contact with him. They considered him a traitor who had succumbed to Jewish propaganda. Ricardo did not retract his statement. He didn't change his last name. He didn't flee from his identity. He chose that his own work would define what that surname meant. He remains a university professor in Germany. When he speaks of his father, he does so honestly, without mitigating factors. 3 of the 4 children maintained the ideology. 1 rejected it. This proportion is not coincidental. It is the exact result of how many years Vera had to work on each of them before the outside world could offer a different narrative. Adolf Eichmann has more than 12 known grandchildren. Klaus had 5 children. Horst had at least 1. Dieter has a family whose composition he keeps secret. Ricardo has his own family. According to testimonies from people close to the family, some of Klaus and Horst's grandchildren were raised with the narrative that their great-grandfather was a hero, a victim of a conspiracy. Others have changed their last name and built lives with no public connection to the Eichmann name. In 2016, Daily Mail investigators located one of Klaus's grandchildren living in Germany under another name. The call lasted seconds. He hung up the phone. The chain that Adolf Eichmann began in the office of the Reich Central Security Office in Berlin, which Vera continued in the house on Garibaldi Street in Buenos Aires, which Klaus and Horst passed on to their own children, reached a 4th generation whose stance on this legacy is mostly unknown. Not all rejected it, not all accepted it, but all of them received it. Christian Kung, vice president of the center, wrote to the bank stating that there was evidence that Swiss banking institutions had claimants presenting themselves as heirs of Nazis included in that list. Credit Suisse did not respond publicly. In 2023, the bank collapsed and was absorbed in an emergency rescue operation. Eva Peron had traveled to Europe in 1947 on a tour that took her to Madrid, Rome, and Geneva. In Madrid, she met with Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank during the Nazi regime and Hitler's Minister of Economics. In Switzerland, she opened 3 safe deposit boxes in banks in Geneva, the contents of which were never publicly inventoried. Juan Domingo Perón tried to claim access to these boxes until his death, unsuccessfully. What they contained and whether some of that content was related to the funds transferred from Europe through Nazi networks is a question that Swiss archives, subject to the strictest banking secrecy in the world, have not answered. The capture of Eichmann did not close the story. It opened panic among the hundreds of fugitives who believed that distance and time protected them. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor responsible for the selections at the platform and for experiments on prisoners, was living in Brazil under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. When the radio announced Eichmann's capture, Mengele left his home within hours. He changed countries, changed his name, and spent the next 20 years moving between Paraguay and Brazil, knowing that the Mossad was searching for him using the same methodology. He died in 1979, drowned on a beach in Brazil after suffering a stroke while swimming. His body was buried under a false name and was not identified until 1985 through forensic dental analysis. Walter Roth, the engineer who had designed the gas trucks used to kill more than 100,000 people on the Eastern Front, increased his security measures in Chile and lived under the protection of Pinochet's government until his death from lung cancer in 1984. He was never extradited. He was never judged. The last documented reference to Mossad surveillance of the Eichmann family in declassified archives dates back to 1985. A brief report mentions contacts within the German community of Buenos Aires, providing updates on individuals of interest. The names are censored. The context suggests that these included the children of Adolf Eichmann. In 2025, Argentine President Javier Milei announced the opening of the historical archives on the Nazi escape network in Argentina. The Simon Wiesenthal Center hoped to find in this documentation information about the mechanisms that allowed hundreds of war criminals to live in Argentina for decades with institutional protection, and about the fate of the capital that Nazi networks transferred to the country during the post-war years. To date, these archives remain sealed. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe and activate the notification bell to stay updated on everything to come.